Hi, I'm Tom Wishon, and again, thanks for your interest in club performance technology. You know, one of the most confusing areas in equipment technology has to do with shaft flex. You know, how do we know of flex? Okay, forever and ever, this industry has referred to different stiffness designs of shafts with a letter scale. L for ladies, A for senior, R for regular flex, S for stiff, X for extra stiff. Okay, well that's all well and good. We have the five, different flexes that we have in there, but how does anybody know exactly how stiff an R is compared to an A or an S? Or for that matter, how does anyone really know how stiff this company's R flex is to each other company's R flex? I have no doubt that there have been a ton of golfers who, when they go into a store, they pick up golf clubs, they're used to their present golf club, let's say maybe having a S flex in it, so they're attracted to the other models that have S flex shafts in them. They hit them, and sometimes they feel about the same stiffness, other times they wonder if something's wrong, because that S flex either feels too whippy or it feels too stiff. Well, welcome to the golf equipment industry. One other area that there has never been any kind of a standard for flex in the industry. So as a result, every company, whether it's a shaft manufacturing company or whether it's a golf club company creating their own shaft models for their club models, they are free to determine and define how stiff each one of the letter flexes are within the shafts they make. And as a result, there's a tremendous variation out there within pretty much all the different flex levels in terms of how stiff is an R, how stiff is an S. No standards whatsoever. Okay, some years ago, this began to really bother me back in the 90s, that I felt that there needed to be some way to provide custom club makers with the ability to really compare the stiffness design of shafts. And so, pretty soon in the industry, we can go all the way back into the 1980s when the very first machines, somewhat like this, which is called a shaft frequency analyzer, were invented. Okay, and the idea of the shaft frequency analyzer was to clamp the shaft into the machine, put a specific weight on the tip end of the shaft, put the shaft into oscillation, and the machine would count the number of oscillations over a period of time. Most notably, it would be a measurement in what were called cycles per minute, with the idea of one up and down motion being a cycle, and the oscillation rate, how many cycles the shaft was making over a period of a minute, within this. And so there have been a myriad of different kinds of shaft frequency analyzers, and for the longest time, the measurement that was used to try to put an empirical measurement on shaft flex was simply to clamp the butt end of the shaft and make one measurement only of the frequency. Okay, well that was a good start, but then you had a situation where shaft companies began to design shafts where the progression of stiffness, or how stiff the tip portion of the shaft was in relation to the butt portion of the shaft, were different. And that was logical because different swing characteristics match up better to different bend profiles or distribution of stiffness over the length of a shaft. But in doing that, when you had a bunch of shafts that were being made that were different in stiffness throughout their whole length, one single butt frequency measurement was not going to be able to identify that this shaft was the same or different than another shaft in here. And so, a number of years ago, this goes back into the 1990s, I became aware of this. I said, well, we need to have different ways to be able to measure the stiffness or relative stiffness through the whole length of the shaft and not just the butt end of the shaft itself. And so I began experimenting with different ways to do it. Mostly I was using frequency analyzers, and the reason for that, instead of using deflection machines, which some people are aware of, to check, the amount that a shaft would bend under a certain load, I chose to use frequency analyzers because this was becoming a very common piece of equipment that many of the custom club makers own and have in their shop. So if I could use a frequency analyzer to come up with a method for being able to compare full-length stiffness design, it would be something that then each of the club makers could do and duplicate and do their own work and measurement in their own shops. Deflection boards, deflection machines were just not commonly available. Those that were not made very well in terms of being able to perform accurate measurements, shaft after shaft. So, arrived on this particular unit, which is a load cell strain gauge version of a frequency analyzer. Okay, some of you may have seen frequency analyzers where there's a clamp, and down here you'll see two pickoff sensors, and it will then, whenever the shaft moves up and down in between the pickoff sensors, it breaks the beam and counts it. Okay, well that was fine for these slower frequency measurements of clamping the butt end, but it wasn't any good when you began to start to measure the shaft in much shorter beam lengths, such as this, where the tip and the oscillation is going to be very fast, and the amplitude, how far up and down it goes, is just too short. So this auditor machine, again made by the brains of Montero Lethierry at golfmechanics.com, became my standard point of equipment for measurement for doing full-length bend profile measurements on shafts. Okay, I went through a number of different types of iterations on how I was going to do this, but the one that we came across in the end was to pick a series of 6 different positions on iron shafts, 7 different positions on shafts for woods, which are longer, okay? And the uniformity was that they were all at the same beam length up from the tip, 11 inches, 16, 21, 26, 31, 36, and then on wood shafts, 41 inches from the tip end. So that way, if you had raw length shafts that may have been 48, 46, 45, 43 inches long, you were then comparing apples to apples with using the same beam length measurements for that. So what we did in this, I worked on this over a number of years, and around 2006, created a piece of software that we called Wishon Golf Bend Profile Software. Okay, it's an ongoing project where we try to solicit the different shaft manufacturers to send us their shafts, multiple numbers of each, so that we could do all the bend profile measurements and weight and other measurements on the shaft to be able to put into a database in this bend profile software program. At present, we have a little over 3,000 different shaft models in there. And it's really, the largest database, I believe, in the industry for being able to compare bend profile measurements, of one shaft to another. Over the last 2 or 3 years, there have been a number of different companies or entities who've chosen to see, well, this is important, so they've come out with their own methodology for doing this, whether it be using EI measurement, which is true stiffness measurement, EI standing for energy inertia, others using other different methods. Okay, whichever, doesn't matter. The idea is that you want to be able to have empirical measurements of the full-length stiffness of shafts over their entire length, so you compare one shaft to another to see exactly how stiff this shaft is compared to that shaft. And you can compare in the butt, the middle, any portion along the shaft all the way down to the tip. More serious club makers use this now as a good way to be able to fit golfers, and especially it can be good where a golfer walks in and he says, I'm thinking about this new, ABC shaft in an R-flex. Can you tell me if that might be a good one for me? Okay. If you don't have this kind of empirical bend profile measurement data, you can't answer that question. So with this, if those shafts under inquiry are in the software database, the club maker can just bring up, different shafts and display them in a graph form with a table for being able to see these actual measurements of relative stiffness along the length of the shaft. And he can then comment and say, okay, this was a little bit softer in the butt, but it's a little stiffer in the tip. And he can make predictions in terms of how a golfer will like a shaft or perform a shaft, which is so much more accurate and better than the information that we have today, which are simply a letter flex that's out there. How stiff is that R? is how stiff is it if they say it's a tip stiff shaft, one way or another. So this is what we're doing right now to be able to express and contribute better comparative information to the custom club makers and to interested golfers as well for being able to do these bend profile measurements. Okay, well, let's talk about one part of this, and that's this relationship of the flex in itself to something that a number of people are aware of called swing speed ratings of shafts. Okay, you've seen this in sometimes where you'll get into certain chart data from shaft companies or component companies where they'll be listing all the different shaft models and flexes, and they may offer what's called a swing speed rating. Say that this particular shaft is an R-flex shaft, it has a swing speed rating of 80 to 90 miles an hour. Or here's a stiff flex shaft, and you see it may have a swing speed rating of 95 to 105 miles an hour. Well, what are they talking about? Okay, basically what they're talking about is that within the physics or the science of the golf swing, almost in most cases, the higher the club head speed, the more actual bending force is going to be applied to some portion of this golf shaft, okay? And the idea is in shaft flex fitting, we want to make sure that the stiffness design of this shaft is set up so that it will bend enough under the golfer's swing, not too much, not too little, okay? And there's a lot of judgment involved in that, but basically what we're doing is that we needed to come up with a methodology to be able to take any golf shaft and to measure its stiffness over a certain length, and then award a swing speed rating for that to say, okay, we have 10 different R-flex shafts. Here's 2 of them that are 80 to 90 miles an hour. Well, here's a couple more that actually are a little stiffer here. So these are really 85 to 95 mile an hour rated. And this way we can overcome some of the problem with the generic nature of using letter flexes like L, A, R, S, and X to try to describe the flex of a shaft. Okay, at Wishon Golf, our methodology that we use for awarding a swing speed rating to a shaft is we will basically use the upper 2/3 of the shaft. We'll use the stiffness measurements, the relative stiffness measurements of the upper 2/3 of the shaft as they progress down. And then we will do that over much experience with fitting golfers and test analysis to be able to identify from our experience what sequence of stiffness change represents a 60 to 70 mile an hour shaft, 65, 75, 70, 80, and so far and so forth up to well over 120 mile an hour rated shaft. It's done through the 41, 36, 31, 26, and 21-inch measurements from, over the shaft. Why not the tip? Why don't we also include the tip section measurements in the swing speed rating? Primarily because of how a golfer's downswing force bends the golf shaft, okay? When we hang on to the golf club in our hands and we get the club to the top of the backswing, up in here, and we make that first move down, that first transition move, that's when our swing puts the first bending force on the golf shaft. And some of you may have seen this in still photography or very, very, high-speed slow motion video, where you'll see right at the split second when the golfer puts that transition force, you'll see that shaft go into a bend. And it's a continuous curve, but it's primarily over the upper 2/3 of the shaft. And that is what we're working on in terms of using the transition force to start the downswing to evaluate the swing speed rating of a particular shaft. Hence the reason that we're focusing on the stiffness measurements over the upper 2/3 of the shaft. The tip section relates itself more to the release. When do you unhinge the wrist cock angle on the downswing? And at that point, because the arms and hands are slowing down and the head is pushing forward against the slowing hands to create a forward bend in the shaft, that mass in the head is now going to push this tip section more than it will the upper section. And that's because in any shaft design, no matter what, in terms of pure stiffness, the tip section is always weaker than the butt section. And that's because it's substantially smaller in diameter than the upper sections of the butt of the shaft with this. So again, swing speed rating, we're looking at the upper 2/3 stiffness measurements of the shaft, because that's the part that's bent with the transition move to start the bending action on the shaft in the downswing. The tip section we don't include, and we look at that separately in shaft fitting based on where the golfer unhinges his wrist cock release coming into impact. So we've created a bunch of proprietary tables and charts within all of our data systems that tell us what actual sequence of stiffness measurements over the upper 2/3 of the shaft is going to be a 70 to 80 mile an hour rated shaft, an 80 to 90, 90 to 100, and so on and so forth. Okay, well, a question comes up as well. How does this all relate to fitting? Okay, tons of shafts you could possibly choose from to fit a golfer. Really difficult to be able to choose one over another unless you've got good comparative data. But the beginning point in shaft fitting has to start by eliminating a whole bunch of shafts from even consideration. And swing speed rating is the beginning of the shaft fitting process for flex and bend profile. Okay, it's a point then where in the fitting process, the golfer is going to be analyzed for his club head speed, for the driver separately, and for a middle iron to get two different swing speed ratings. So let's say, for example, you have a golfer hits a bunch of shots and his average club head speed with a driver is 90 miles an hour. Okay, that gives you a point where you'd say, okay, logically, I want to look for shafts that are going to be rated 85 to 95 miles an hour because this 90 miles an hour is right in the middle, of that range, right in there. Okay, but there can be variations in that determined by how much force the golfer has to put a bending force on the shaft. And let me explain in this manner. This is how the more advanced club fitters do their flex fitting with swing speed rating. Okay, here's the example. Let's say we got 3 golfers, okay? All 3 golfers have the same 90 mile an hour driver club head speed, okay? But golfer number 1, he is extremely aggressive. Short 3/4 length backswing, pours on the coals and is accelerating the club. He is a definite hitter, of the shot, like that. Definitely, more aggression in that, okay? So he's putting more bending force on the shaft. Golfer number 2, let's say he's kind of average in there. You're seeing some sense of force with the transition move, but it's definitely not a passive, very slow acceleration. The same token, it's not a super aggressive hitter with this. And then let's say golfer number 3 with his same 90 mile an hour club head speed, distinct pause at the top, a very gradual start to the downswing, not a very strong transition move, but he still accelerates the club to get to 90 miles an hour, okay? 3 different golfers, same club head speed at 90 miles an hour, but totally different amounts of bending force that they're putting on the shaft as they go from transition to release on the downswing. Okay, so let's say golfer number 2, the average transition force, 90 mile an hour club head speed. The club fitter is going to look for shafts that are 85 to 95 miles an hour because he's going to sit right in the middle of that 85, 95 mile an hour swing speed range. But golfer number 1, with a much stronger transition move, who's putting more of a bending force on the shaft, an 85 to 95 mile an hour rated shaft for his 90 mile an hour club head speed might be too weak, might not be stiff enough, because remember, for his 90 mile an hour swing, he's putting a lot more bending force on the shaft with this very aggressive, strong transition move down at the ball. So the smart club fitter then looks at this 90 mile an hour golfer with a very aggressive move at the ball and says, no, I'm not looking for 85, 95. I think what I want for this guy is a 90 to 100 rated shaft, okay? So his club head speed at 90 with more bending force on the shaft is at the bottom end of the swing speed rating, meaning the shaft is a little stiffer than what an average 90 mile an hour player would use. And so that's how the swing speed rating system, if done correctly, can really help to pinpoint getting the basic flex or the upper 2/3 stiffness of the shaft well matched to the golfer's club head speed and his bending force that he puts on the shaft from his transition move and downswing tempo, downswing acceleration. Again, the last point in that example, the guy who was 90 miles an hour with a very passive, smooth swing, not a lot of bending force. Okay, the smart club fitter now looks at him and says, he's not putting as much bending force on the shaft as a normal 90 mile an hour swing. So I'm going to give this 90 mile an hour golfer with a smooth transition, I want to put him into an 80 to 90 mile an hour rated shaft. So the shaft's a little softer than what an average 90 mile an hour with a more aggressive swing would need. And again, a good way to use the swing speed rating of the shaft to match up to the golfer's club head speed and then additionally to his downswing acceleration force. And so that's the part of shaft fitting in shaft flex fitting, where they're matching the golfer's swing speed and shaft bending force, as indicated by the transition and downswing acceleration, to the shaft swing speed rating. And then after that, they go into the point of analyzing where the wristcock release is to then predict whether or not this golfer, in addition to that, needs a tip firm, tip medium, tip flexible shaft, depending on how late he releases the club, how early he releases the club. And that's the picture of how analytical shaft fitting has to be done. It can't be done using just letters of L, A, R, S, and X, because there's never been a standard in the industry for how stiff any of those are. And that still doesn't express how the shaft changes in its stiffness distribution over its whole length. So this is one of the areas, again, one of the many areas that we've been working on at Wishon Golf, and I've been working on for 20 years, at this point, to be able to try and take shaft flex and bend profile fitting into something that's a lot more orderly and procedurally oriented to come up with much better results in the fit of the shaft's stiffness design. Thanks very much for your interest and for your attention, and best wishes in this great game.